Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, everybody, and welcome to episode 20 of the Art of Procurement show. So today's guest is Terri Gallagher. Terri is President and CEO of Gallagher & Consultants. Gallagher & Consultants are an advisory firm that help companies build and implement end-to-end workforce management strategies. Terri is an expert in the field of human capital management, and specifically a field of expertise or a focus is in contingent or temporary labour. As you'll hear, Terri's been an executive of a number of different service providers in the space. As an example, Adecco, the Manpower-owned Tapfin, and NextSource. So Terri and I first connected late last year based on a shared interest in understanding what the future of work looks like, and specifically the rise of the temporary worker. So I believe, as I know I've mentioned on the show before, that this trend is really going to impact both the procurement professional, but also how we buy people-oriented services on behalf of our stakeholders. What I wanted to do with today's show is really have an introduction to how companies can more effectively manage their contingent workforce. And Terri and I talk about the dynamics of the contingent labour market and how strategic management of your temp labour program can really help reap some pretty significant rewards over essentially being more passive management of the program. Something that was really interesting for me to dive deeper into was the role that procurement can and the role that procurement should play in the management of temporary labour. I asked Terri some examples of where procurement can really bring value, where she's seen in the real world examples, and the role that procurement plays with HR and finance in the management of the spend category. Because in my personal experience, I've often seen that kind of HR and procurement, nobody's really sure who manages it. There's not really a consistent approach. So I wanted to understand from Terri what she has seen in the delivery of programs like this to Fortune 100 and Fortune 500 companies. I think that the show today is going to be valuable for a couple of different groups of procurement professionals. Firstly, there's those that are involved in the management of the HR and contingent labour categories. You'll get first-hand insights into the category, including some best practices from an exec who has spent significant time and has significant experience working in the field. Secondly, if you have responsibilities for purchasing any people-based services, I'm thinking consulting professional services, IT services, marketing, those are just four that spring to mind, then I think it's important to be well versed on the contingent labour category and the marketplace, given that I think the number of things that we buy today from service providers tomorrow might be provided by individuals or smaller groups of individuals, and we'll be purchasing from worker intermediation platforms rather than service providers. Before I go into the show, I do finally want to let you know that I recently published a report called the 21 Tips to help you secure your dream procurement job. So the report is a summary of tips and tricks that cover the entire job search process, compiled from Art of Procurement interviews with experts in the procurement recruitment field. So if you're thinking of looking at a job change in 2016, I'd really recommend you go and download that. That's at artofprocurement.com/21tips. That's artofprocurement.com/21tips. The final thing before we move on to the show is that something I'm really keen on the Art of Procurement is to discuss case studies. So real-life examples of procurement leaders, procurement teams, procurement professionals who have really been pretty innovative in responding to a specific challenge that they may have had that is really valuable to share with the procurement community, because I think that is how we all learn best. So what I'd like to do is just invite anybody, if you're listening today and you know of a great example or a case study of where procurement has really made a difference, then or has been on a transformation journey or helped in a particular innovative way on a project or in a spend category, please let me know, because I would love to talk to the individuals involved in that on the show and have some case study shows. To reach out to me, the best way is just to go to artofprocurement.com/recommend. That's artofprocurement.com/recommend. And there's a contact form on there. You can just type in the details, send that off. That comes into my inbox and I will reach back out to you. So that's artofprocurement.com/recommend. Okay, well, with that being said, let's move on to today's show. Hi there, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Art of Procurement. So today's guest is Terri Gallagher. And as I mentioned in the pre-show, Terri's an expert in the contingent labour space and has held executive-level positions at a number of really market-leading temporary staffing solution providers. Terri is now President and CEO of Gallagher and Consultants. So Terri, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Phil. I'm pleased to be here and will certainly do my best to contribute to the art of procurement and provide something useful for the listeners. Very excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Terri. No, I'm really excited as well of what we're going to talk about. But before we do go into the conversation, I'd just love for the listeners of Art of Procurement just to get to know you a little bit more. So I wonder if you could give a brief overview of your background.
Absolutely. So I've been in the contingent workforce space for about 20 years. I have a lot of experience in contingent temp workforce strategies. And basically, I decided to go out on my own because I see a lot of changes in the industry and the workforce space and wanted to introduce a component of innovation and bring solutions that really are targeted to where the workforce is today. So my approach is really based on current state workforce trends and incorporating more of a cutting edge technology and globalization factors, which we'll talk about today, that are rapidly changing the landscape. So I've held multiple executive roles in this space. I've sold, solution designed, managed programs anywhere from 20 million to 2 billion in spend, and also have done some international speaking and writing, and I will do my very best today to contribute something useful.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a fantastic background, very well versed in the space, obviously, and I think the challenge for us is keeping it down to 45 minutes with the amount of information I know that you have to share with the listeners. So I'm excited.
Me too.
The one thing is that, we both jumped off the cliff really into business ownership about the same time last year. From my perspective, it's kind of scary but exciting. I just wondered how you were finding it.
Absolutely. I think anytime you want to do something a little bit different or, look at where your strengths are and then really capitalize on that, it's interesting being on the stage by yourself, but it's exhilarating and absolutely worth the leap. And, the net does follow most of the time. So I think it's just been an amazing adventure so far.
No, I'm with you. It's you wait and wait and wait, waiting for the right time, and there's no right time. And when you do it, it's kind of some hope, but I wouldn't change it.
Nope, agreed.
Well, one of the key themes on Art of Procurement so far has been access to talent, and it's always been with a procurement slant. But I know today we're going to focus more on the contingent workforce category itself, really looking more about how we manage talent across the business rather than specifically within procurement. So what I'd like to do first is just to start with some basics. There's a lot of terms that are kind of thrown around in contingent labour, MSP, VMS, there's a bunch of other acronyms. I just wondered if you could just give a brief kind of intro to what the category is and how it's structured, if you will, from the service providers that are within it.
Yeah, so there is a lot of terms, and even myself, I've been in this 20 years, and I see a few. I come across a few that I've got a different definition, but contingent workforce management, temp workforce management, it's all basically looking at the same thing: is how do people leverage and optimize their temporary labor. So you're seeing a lot of words used like the gig economy, and that's a different type of temp labor, but it's still temp labor. Right. So workforce intermediary, that's the new term for the MSPs. So it's really just all about the outsourcing of temp labor and how that's managed, leveraged, and optimized. It's still the same game.
To go even, I guess, 101 for a second, an MSP is managed service provider, so that's somebody who would manage the agencies within your program. Is that right?
Correct. So the MSP service provider is really the one that sits in the middle, kind of like at the control tower at LaGuardia. So they sit in the middle and then they interface with the managers to, get requirements, get them out to the supplier community, and they enable that with technology. So a lot of a lot of people hear VMS, vendor management system. That's typically the technology used
Okay.
for these programs, but that's also changing. There's some other options out there.
And so, based on your experience, is there a minimum amount of temp labor spend that a company would need to have before it makes sense to invest in suppliers like MSPs or VMSs?
That's a great question. And there really is no minimum. If you've got the smaller programs, 10 or 15, 20 million, those programs are probably going to look very different just because of the financial models that most MSPs use. There's still a way to accommodate those types of programs using shared services and a combination of some other things. But at the end of the day, the spend, there's no such thing as spend too low. It's more around how do you structure the program to accommodate that type of spend and still be profitable.
And what level of penetration do you usually see in an MSP? So, how many companies who have the scale to really go who have the size, to go full tilt on an MSP and VMS program? Does every company do it today? They just do it differently? Or are there companies out there who should be doing it that are really just managing contractors and agencies individually, like maybe they were doing 10 years ago?
That's a great question. The penetration rate is definitely getting higher. There has been an explosion of temp labor growth, and it could be anywhere from 18%, the average, up to 50% of their workforce. And there's very high penetration from a contingent workforce management perspective. There's a lot of MSPs out there. I think one of the quotes I saw was they, are running roughly 72% of these programs, but there's still a lot of companies out there that have a high number of temp workers that really don't have solutions. In fact, far more than I think people realize. I found that anecdotally just getting out and working with these companies, and a lot of them are either trying to cobble something together internally, or they've got certain components that, they're bringing in different people to help with pieces of it. But there's still a tremendous opportunity out there for companies that really don't have anything in place. And I think there's more than people realize.
So you hear more and more about the increasing in temporary labor and the workforce economy, looking at more freelancers coming into the economy. What are kind of the changes that are making it more of a necessity now to have a strategy around how you manage your temporary labor program versus maybe 5 or 10 years ago?
I love this question. There's been tremendous changes over, since the big recession, or they call it the Great Recession. Of course, there's nothing great about it, but it's really turned the workforce landscape on its ear. So, since the recession ended back in, I think it was 2010, 2011, we've seen an explosion in the temp workforce. Some of the stats thrown around is by the year 2020, it's expected to make up half our workforce. And so when you look at that, 20 years ago, when some of these MSPs came out, the usage of temp labor was much less. So they could kind of, provide that functional control and oversight, which is really the model today. And that worked, that sufficed. But for today's workforce landscape, it really doesn't, because you've got temp workforce making up a much larger percentage of a company's workforce. So with that comes, companies needing true workforce strategy. So it's not just about managing cost and spend and visibility, which you need that's certainly foundational, but it's about what is the workforce strategy? How do we leverage this temp talent for bottom line results? Some of the other things you're also seeing is globalization of the workforce. So many organizations are multinational now, and the world is flattening.
Right.
So when there was an SAP Oxford Economics survey of 2,700 execs, and they asked them, what is the number one labor market shift having an impact on your workforce? And they said, it's basically managing global temp talent, globalization of the workforce. So you've got that component where it's really critical to have a way to manage and leverage that talent. It's extremely complex because you've got regulatory and tax and cultural requirements
Right.
that if you don't understand those things, you could be fined, your labor could be deported. So you've got kind of that component. And then last and third is technology. I personally feel that technology is really driving what's going on with workforce management. You've got mobile capabilities now. You've got the VMS players, the vendor management systems, now integrating mobile. They're getting much better at integrating with client systems. Then you've got the online, workforce intermediary platforms, online and freelancer platforms that are now coming in as players that were not players 10 years ago. So you've got kind of those three components creating this perfect storm of, now clients are coming out and saying, we really want something more than that functional control. We really want holistic solutions.
So I jotted a couple of questions down just as you were talking there. And the first one I was interested in understanding your perspective on is that, we see a lot of reports in the press. MBO Partners puts out a great report about the size of the independent workforce. And you referenced something about, 2020 projections of half the workforce being temporary. Mm-hmm. Is that something? So a lot of people say, well, it's just kind of a shuffling of the deck chairs, that people have always been independent. They're just using different channels to work temporarily. Do you see in your experience that there truly is a growth or an explosion in the number of people who are moving from traditional jobs into temporary or contingent roles?
Yeah, I think there is. And I think the other challenge too is quantifying those numbers, because you've got, the different labor and regulatory organizations trying to calculate what is the true percentage of temp labor, and their numbers are off. They're wildly off. And I think part of that's because they're having challenges even classifying the labor and what is truly temp. To your point, there's a lot of shifts that have happened, social shifts in the way that people look at work. And you've got the millennials who love the flexibility and they love new assignments. You have baby boomers leaving the workforce, which is creating these huge gaps and huge opportunities for those that want to work independently to, kind of take up those gaps. And then you've also got just, people are a little disenfranchised with corporate America. They don't feel like they can go and work there and that'll be a safe and stable place. The Great Recession changed that. So people want to create their own stability now. They see opportunities to create their own stability, create their own career path, make sure that they're marketable. And that's what MBO Partners was talking about. So it really is more people jumping into the temp workforce pool and saying, this is a good thing.
Yeah, my own personal perspective, I think, is it will continue to grow because organizations as well are looking to become more flexible and
Absolutely.
wanting to have a lot less fixed cost, or what they may consider as being fixed cost, even though they can let go an employee at any moment. But using temporary staffing solutions and technologies means they can access people on fractional basis rather than having to bring somebody in, onboard them, and all the cost associated with that. So that they can scale up and down as business needs require.
Yeah, Phil, that's a great point. And also, yeah, you're right. From the organization and client perspective is, it works on both sides. The clients love the fact that they can be fluid with their labor planning, and particularly with some of these factors, the globalization and, the market changing on a dime is, it makes it very attractive. And you've got workers on the other side that are also pleased. So, you hear all this stuff about gig workers and being taken advantage of and, the benefits and, you've got, obviously the Uber lawsuits. I think really it's more about not workers being taken advantage of or, does this work for where we are as a workforce landscape. It's really more about what do we need to now look at? It is here to stay. This type of workforce landscape isn't changing. It's going to grow, as you said. And so a lot of the regulatory bodies and labor bodies are looking at how do we standardize and look at the classification and create for those procurement managers out there and HR, how do we create standards that are easy to follow and how people are classified. In fact, there's even talk today of a third labor category that helps accommodate this.
And actually, that was going to be my next question too, is that while workforce trends are kind of accelerating, the changes accelerating, regulatory. It's been the same for a number of years in terms of worker classification, and there's always talk of changes. But I see that's really an imperative if temporary labor, temporary workforce is going to accelerate to where it could go based on the technology and based on organizational demands. Do you see that there'll be change and this is specifically to the US, in the workforce classification and some of the regulatory issues, or do you think that will always inhibit the potential growth?
I'm not going to pretend to be a labor lawyer. I'm pretty well versed in some of these laws, but I think change is going to come slowly, right? You look at the Industrial Revolution and how long did it take to finally regulate the age of workers so you didn't have 7-year-olds crawling in and out of machines.
Right.
So it's going to take a long time, but I think that, we're seeing rumblings of those changes. I don't see it slowing down the growth. When you look at Uber and it's in the news about this huge class action lawsuit, and yet Uber and Lyft are both having large investors, a large influx of capital of, you've got, I think GM with Uber, you got to, I'll have to look up my notes here, but they just gave them an influx of cash. So nobody's nervous about it.
Lyft, I think it was.
Yeah.
So I think that it's, as more complexity comes into the temporary workforce space, it becomes more and more important to look at using technology and intermediaries to kind of manage that and pull it all together. I wonder from your perspective, and I know that you've got a ton of experience in this field, what were the typical benefits that clients would see of using MSPs, VMSs, and frankly, whatever comes next?
There's definitely still benefits. I think that the MSP model, we talked a little bit about this, has got to make some changes, and the big players are working on that. So they're really, looking at technology being a driver, moving beyond that functional control into providing true workforce strategy. But some of the foundational components are never going to go away. So I know for the procurement leaders, this is going to be a good one, but the cost savings, typically when you don't have the expertise to manage this internally, there's a very large cost savings component opportunity. So some of that comes from just introducing some negotiating with your vendors and using expertise to negotiate. I think that it's important to look at, and this is where I think procurement leaders sometimes can stumble a little bit, is you've got it, the cost savings is absolutely critical, and that's a big component, but you've also got to look at this holistically and make sure that you've got the expertise to present those cost savings in a way that's still going to maintain that high quality talent and getting the resources in the door as quickly as possible. It's definitely a delicate balance.
Yeah, and I think it's one that drives probably a lot of angst between stakeholders and procurement. In procurement, if procurement is taking the approach of just seeking to get the lowest possible cost rather than maybe optimizing the cost. So when you look at examples of procurement organizations who have done well in managing their in achieving cost savings that are possible, but without necessarily impacting the quality of work and the quality of individual that they've been able to hire through a temporary worker program, what are the things that they've done? How have they balanced kind of the need for the right person and the need to be to get as optimal as possible cost?
So I think that the key is to know your level of disruption and appetite for disruption. So, obviously the more aggressive cost saving goals you have, the more disruption you're going to have to the organization, the more disruption you're going to have to your supply chain. So I think it's important to have the right expertise on the other side to guide you through that understands your organization and can make recommendations that will mirror what your level of your tolerance of disruption is. So, there's savings can come in many forms. It can come from, kind of the traditional negotiating with suppliers. It can also come from changing the way you use your workforce and looking at overtime. It can come in the form of soft cost savings around just, systemic process efficiencies around invoicing. I'll give you an example. I had a very large multinational manufacturing company. Their first year, we were able to save them $2 million just going back and negotiating with their suppliers, but doing it in a way that still allowed the suppliers to have enough markup to go and source for the right talent that they needed. And then another thing we found is that in their invoicing, they were over invoicing one particular supplier and have been doing it for years. So once we provided that visibility and audit trail, via technology, they were able to recover those monies. But you'd be surprised how much of that happens when you've got, if you don't have real robust technology and audit trails.
And I think it's important to note that the savings opportunities you talk about, not one of them was necessarily impacting the person that's coming into the company. It's kind of savings that are available by optimizing the process as opposed to beating up the person who you want to bring in to get 20% off his rate.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think the key to that is to have that workforce intermediary expertise that can guide you through that process and to ensure that the negotiations are handled properly to not impact the talent. Because again, cost savings done to the extreme then impacts your talent.
Right.
And then all these other levers are now upside down and your KPIs are off. And
so over and above cost savings, what are some other benefits that you see of utilizing this expertise in the management of your temp labor?
Well, the other is just visibility and clarity, which should never be underestimated. You can't manage what you can't measure. So a lot of the technology, whether you use a VMS or some other type of internal technology platform, now provides that visibility around spend, quality, peaks and lulls, usage. At the end of the day, knowledge is power, and knowing, where and how many contractors you have, how their usage is trending by division, department. Do you have turnover issues? This is particularly important in the manufacturing sector. If you've got a plant that they can't keep workers, a lot of times it's not the supply chain. A lot of times it's something that's internal within that plant that now can be brought to the surface with the audit trail and some of the other data points that are in the system and in the technology. So that's certainly a very important one. And then, the third, obviously we talked a little bit about this, but the improved quality of talent.
Yeah.
The talent shortage is absolutely real, particularly in STEM, and it's going to continue to grow. Just to give you an interesting stat, at the end of last year, you see all these things about the unemployment rate, and despite 14.9 million unemployed workers, there's still 2.5 million jobs for which employers couldn't fill, and a lot of that is in the knowledge economy. So having the right workforce strategy to bring in high quality temp workers, that's a very viable option. Temp workers are not what people thought they were 20 years ago, where it's like your last resort. I mean, you've got some of your best talent that only sits in the temp worker community because they like it. They like the flexibility.
Yeah, and that's where I think there's opportunity for growth. And, I talk about the as a service economy specific to procurement, but I think it's relevant across other departments as well, that the folks that have the expertise that's highly in demand are able to then go into becoming an independent worker and sell their time on a fractional basis. And actually probably make a lot more money in doing so, because they can start pricing their expertise based on the value they create rather than time and materials. And so I see a huge opportunity, in the procurement space for subject matter experts for particular categories, as an example in doing it. But it opens up a whole new kind of way of working, rather than feeling like you just have to go and work for a corporation and kind of be just doing, supporting one company, one client also helps you diversify your revenue base. So I definitely see an opportunity in what's kind of termed as a knowledge economy in procurement, and I guess that's the case in other functions too.
You're absolutely right. It's really about looking at where the workforce landscape is today, and that's where it is today. So having multiple channels and ways to connect to this talent is a very savvy workforce strategy.
So how does selecting the right workforce intermediary and technology partner and mix contribute to the bottom line results?
This workforce intermediary is going to be one of your most valuable assets, particularly when you look at a fourth or more of your workforce is now most likely temporary talent. So they really have to have the expertise, and they can really be kind of that trusted advisor to guide you through the entire process. Because, there is a little bit of disruption when you're bringing in a solution and technology and bringing in kind of a centralized platform. You really need somebody that's going to be that guide to take you through the entire life cycle. So you want to make sure that you select somebody that understands not only the technology pieces, but understands what stakeholders you need to have at the table. And this, I cannot stress enough. So many times you've got, procurement coming in and making a decision, and then they bring in maybe a couple of people.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest challenges when staffing industry analysts surveyed contingent workforce managers within organizations and asked them what was the biggest challenge to the program, they said the biggest challenge or hurdle they had was adoption. And the reason for that is if you don't have all the right players at the table at the beginning of solutioning and implementing, and the right workforce intermediary can help you select those players, it just creates a lot of downstream problems. Making sure that they understand that clarity is an important facet of your workforce. So spend, performance, labor, trending, using that expertise to have that right marriage between the intermediary and the technology piece is just so important. So when you're looking at, do we want to outsource this? Do we want to keep it in-house? I think bringing in someone to look at your entire organization and not just your spend and your temp labor, but what systems do you already have in place? What integrations may you need to have with some of these VMS players? Who are your key sponsors? Do you have any detractors? I'll give you an example. There was a very large chemical manufacturing plant. I can't name their name, but they launched a relatively large program, and they had all the right players for the most part: IT, HR, procurement. You need IT because there could be integration components, the CFO to make sure that they were on board with all of the cost accounting that needs to go in place. And they kind of left the plant managers out of it. They said, they'll be fine, they'll be on board. Well, there's one particular plant manager that was in charge of about $20 million worth of revenue that was not really engaged. And he really had a problem with this program and was a very strong detractor, was not on board, and he was also a strong influencer within the organization. So it created a lot of downstream challenges with adoption and change management. So the workforce intermediary will be able to help you navigate that and make sure you've got the right person at the table. So it's just so critical that you get that expertise up front, and picking the right workforce intermediary and asking them those probing questions before you sign the contract is important.
No, and understanding kind of what the unique situation of a particular client or company is, so you can build a program that meets what their needs is, rather than something that a service provider may want to sell them.
Yeah, and absolutely. And the MSPs, for instance, they're really not the right people to help you make a technology decision, right? You're not going to have the right people at the table. So it's getting the right people at the table. And if you decide to go with an MSP, along with the MSPs that can help make those technology decisions.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk specifically about the role of procurement in the management of temporary labor. You've got a really interesting vantage point, because essentially as being an outsider looking in for a lot of your career and being on the client side. So what is the role of procurement versus, say, HR? What do you typically see?
Well, I think that we're starting to see procurement get more involved in taking the lead in more of these programs. Historically, the ideal program is a procurement and HR influenced program. Procurement, from my, tends to be very focused. I don't want to kind of categorize here, but they tend to be very focused on cost savings, and there is a commoditization of labor, and in some ways, labor really is a commodity. And so I think that it's very important for procurement leaders to look beyond just the commodity and the cost savings, and that's going to be a given. You're going to get your cost savings. But because now the workforce takes up such a large, the temp workforce takes up such a large part of your organization, you've really got to look at all the other pieces. Are you getting the data and analytics that you need to make smart decisions? Are you seeing the quality, i.e., that plant manager at the chemical company? It's very important that they see the speed and the quality in getting the talent in the door. Is the program hitting on all the the key KPIs? How is adoption? So those are things that procurement really needs to look at when viewing these programs.
Yeah, and I guess as well with when you look at the knowledge worker segment, that brings in a whole more nuanced kind of approach to understanding what the right cost is and the value of bringing somebody in, because the rates aren't, it's not necessarily that you're bringing somebody in who you've got a choice of 100 different people, and it's truly a cost decision. And you're not, as procurement, necessarily able to be the ones to judge the value and the expertise that one person can bring to an organization. Mm-hmm. So it probably needs to be a lot more of a pragmatic approach today as workforce shifts than just purely looking at it from a cost perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think selecting that right workforce intermediary can help procurement with that and say, here are the people that need to be at the table besides you, and do that in a way that procurement understands. And ultimately you want to set up procurement for success, or HR, whoever is going to be leading these programs. And I think it's just really important that they understand that these are the stakeholders, these are the key components, and then walk them through that process.
Do you typically see HR leading the program or procurement leading the program? My experience has been that it's varied, but also there's a lack of, desire internally to kind of put your hands up and say, I'm managing temporary labor, because of everything that comes with it internally. And so it kind of gets left to hang out there and nobody is picking up the bag. Is that just the experiences that I've had, or do you see that more against the industry?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Sometimes it sits with HR because it landed on their lap, or it might sit with procurement. And I think a couple years ago, that was more the norm, where it's just that commodity that somebody's got to handle. But today, it's gone above and beyond just being a commodity to a key workforce strategy. So now you're seeing procurement and HR collaborating more on these types of programs. But I definitely see a shift where it seems to be more in procurement's hands, and particularly when you're looking at some of the changes with staffing in, the staffing supply chain, and it's just a natural fit for them.
So I'm interested in, maybe the listeners can take some learning from the show. Is what are some examples where you've seen procurement being particularly engaged in a way that brought value, and not just bringing a process to identifying the service providers, but actually playing an active role in the management of the program? What did they do? What is it that procurement can do to help bring value in this space?
Well, I think some of the best examples I've seen are procurement leaders that are really plugged into the organization and are, good about connecting with the right leaders, across divisions, across global entities, whatever that is, to ensure that this solution and this program is cascaded down. The best procurement leaders are also very collaborative, so they are willing and actually want to collaborate with these workforce intermediaries, and it's a very, very much a, how can we take this program to the next level? Mm-hmm. It's what the procurement leader will say, here's what I'm hearing from the organization, these are the challenges, how can we solve these, whether it's quality, whether it's we hate the tool and we don't want to work with it, whether it's, we've got some concerns with some of the audit trails, we've got maybe an industrial, you've got a plant site that has got some safety and regulatory training that's not being taken care of. But the ideal procurement person is somebody that's very plugged into the organization, very collaborative, and really understands all of the components that work with these programs. And those are the ones that are the most successful and see really the most value. And there is a lot of value, particularly now. It's almost like you have to look at, temp workforce strategy. It's just too large a part of your organization. So
on the flip side, when you were on the client side, what kind of mistakes did you see clients repeatedly make? You wanted to kind of shake them and say, don't do that. What would you wish that they would do differently that a lot of mistakes companies did make?
That's a good one. I don't want to certainly alienate anyone on this call, but and Mistake is a strong word, but maybe it's just because they weren't informed. But I think, the biggest thing is implementing too quickly,
Yeah.
not getting the right people involved, um, kind of letting the MSP or the workforce intermediary just kind of run with it, and not being actively engaged. Because at the end of the day, the workforce intermediary cannot be the one to go and sell this program for you. Or if, they need to make decisions around technology landscape, they really need to have that champion. So not being involved is a lethal mistake, to be frank. You've got to be very much involved and collaborative. I think overselling expectations, going out to the organization and saying that, there's not going to be any disruption. This is going to be great. We're going to save you X amount of dollars. You're going to see increases with, quality, performance, whatever that is. I think that they've got to be very realistic in setting the expectations. At the end of there is some disruption initially. It's absolutely worth it downstream, and you'll see the savings and the quality, and you'll get the visibility and the clarity and the strategy. But I think it's being very clear about what to expect, and just tempering the expectations with the timeline. The first year is going to be a bit challenging, but I think those are some of the biggest things. It's the collaboration, it's the level setting expectation, and being involved.
Yeah, I see when, so I've helped implement procurement outsourcing programs in the past, and definitely the biggest threat to the long-term success of a program in procurement outsourcing is that a client will sign a deal and kind of wash their hands and walk away and say, okay, we've got the contracts in place. Now it's over to the service provider. It's kind of their deal to figure out. Whereas the most successful programs are the ones where really the client takes a proactive role in change management. That's always been key for me in procurement space, and it sounds like that's the case in contingent workforce too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really a marriage between two parties, the client and the workforce intermediary. It is a very collaborative. It's a very collaborative solution, and you really need both to continue to work together.
So we're bouncing up against our time limit today. I just had one final question, and that would be, it could be a repeat of something that you've talked about already, but what would be the single most important piece of advice, I guess, you would give to somebody in procurement who is starting to think about, or has been challenged by their organization to think about putting in place a temporary workforce solution?
That's a great question. I think the best is to educate yourself first. Spend a little bit of time going out and, reading blogs. SIA is a good one, Staffing Industry Analysts, and look at some of the trends, look at some of the, who the players are out there, because knowledge is power. I think a lot of times when you kind of hand it completely over to someone coming in that's providing that consulting, it's just, it just makes for a very challenging way to put together a solution. So get educated, don't be afraid to ask those probing questions, and you can't ask them if you don't understand the market enough. And I think that's probably the most important thing. And then just be open, be open to the fact that this is a huge benefit, that if done right, it can really put this procurement leader on the map. I've seen procurement leaders get promoted quite rapidly after, putting in some of these programs that were very successful and saw, hitting all the KPIs. So it's worth it to do that work up front.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that changing labor patterns, they're probably one of the biggest challenges and opportunities as well that organizations face over the next few years. Mm-hmm. The identification and management of temporary resources, I think, is going to become a key tenet of all spend categories from a procurement perspective, not just the temporary labor category in itself, as more and more services become as a service, and also become where you can bring in temporary workers and freelancers to do work that service providers may have done in the past. So I definitely think there's more to come on this subject. With all that being said, Terri, I'd just like to ask, what's the best way that listeners can find you if they're interested in continuing the conversation?
I would love to, because I could just talk about this all day. They can contact me via email. It's terri@gallagherandconsultants.com.
Mm-hmm.
Or if they're in a big hurry, they can call me, 704-620-2483. I would love to engage them, ask any questions they have, and it's one of my favorite topics, so
Great.
I'll welcome the call.
Well, what I'll do is I'll link up your contact details on the show notes page for this episode. That's going to be at artofprocurement.com/temporary labor. And for everybody outside the States, I'm afraid that's the US spelling for labor, LOBOR. So that's artofprocurement.com/temporary labor. So Terri, I just want to thank you for your time again today. And I think very insightful conversation. I definitely think there's more to come on this. We've only really scratched the surface. But thanks for joining us on The Art of Procurement. And I'm sure that we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Phil. It was a pleasure and a delight, and thank you for the listeners for hanging in there. It's been great talking with you.
Thanks, Terri.
Thank you.